Constitution spells out the model of separation of powers in the first three articles of the Constitution. It also spells out how checks and balances function to protect the freedoms of American citizens. Now let's see this system in action by examining some real events from American history. Let's take it all the way back to the early 1800s. President Thomas Jefferson had just taken office, and he has some problems with several officials that his predecessor, John Adams, appointed before the end of his term. One of them is a man named William Marbury, who Adams made a justice of the peace. Jefferson tells his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver Marbury's commissioning papers, which basically means Marbury can't start his new job. Marbury takes his case to the Supreme Court. He believes that the Judiciary Act of 1789, a law passed by Congress, gives the court the power to order Madison to deliver the commissioning papers. So what does the court decide? The court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, agrees with Marbury that it was illegal to withhold his papers. However, they also find that they themselves do not have the authority to compel Jefferson or Madison to act, that it's beyond the scope of their power as outlined in the Constitution. The Supreme Court declares that the Judiciary Act of 1789, the law that Congress had passed giving them that kind of authority, is unconstitutional and therefore null and void. Looking back, this was an important moment for the Supreme Court. The case established that the court had the power to throw out laws passed by Congress that they found were unconstitutional. This power is known as judicial review, and it's a big check that the court has over Congress.
Okay, class. So I enjoyed that coverage of Marbury versus Madison. And I think if you're talking about the Constitution and early American history, that is the most important case about the powers that are in the first three articles of the Constitution and the checks and balances between them, and how the Supreme Court gave itself the legitimacy that it enjoys today. Now, if the Supreme Court makes an unpopular decision, they can either reverse themselves, which is very rare. We left off, with Plessy versus Ferguson being overturned by Brown versus the Board of Education and eliminating the policy in the United States, the longstanding policy of separate but equal. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson, we talked about was that case involving racial discrimination on public transportation in New Orleans. And of course, Brown versus Board of Education overturned that policy. So it's possible, but it's rare. The other way to overturn an unpopular decision in the Supreme Court is to modify the Constitution, to amend the Constitution. And doing that's very difficult. It requires 2/3 of both of the houses of Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate must approve it by a supermajority, 2/3. Then it has to go to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify any amendment. Now, as far as amending the Constitution, I got another little video here, which it's a stand-up comedy about some of the amendments in history that I think is funny and worth sharing.
Well, listen, our Constitution is a living document. You can change things. First of all, we just had the Constitution. We didn't have any of the amendments. Then we were like, here's the First Amendment. In America, you can say whatever the fuck you want. Then we realized the Second Amendment was, but you're gonna need some guns. A few amendments later, we're like, oh my God, this drinking is out of control. No more alcohol. Alcohol is illegal. A couple amendments later, we're like, now that we're thinking straight, let's give women the right to vote. A couple amendments later, we're like, oh, we're gonna need that alcohol back. But the people in charge want to.
I thought that was some good humor there about some of the amendments. And, back to the Supreme Court, there's two philosophies in the Supreme Court, basic philosophies that you want to be aware of. And there's the judges who are more strict constructionalist or have judicial restraint. So they're seen as conservative. And they're seen as judges who don't want to engage in, to be very active as a judge. They want to stick to the Constitution the way it's written, in other words. And then there's the other camp, which are more liberal, and those are seen as judicial activists. And we have a very divided court as of the recording of this video. I got the New York State Bar Association Law Journal, the newest version, and that's the cover story. It looks backwards, I guess, on this video, but it says supremely divided. And you've got a big divide between the conservatives and the liberals, or the strict constructionalists versus the judicial activists, which are in the minority right now. So there's quite a bit of a rift on the Supreme Court, which means probably laws aren't going to change very much with the current Supreme Court. They're going to be very conservative, and they're probably not going to impact us with any social issues. And you see that recently with their sidestepping an abortion case. And Roe v. Wade from 1973 was, a 7-2 decision that gave women the constitutional right to safe access to an abortion. And since then, the Supreme Court, up until recently, had stopped any law that seemed to challenge that. And we saw recently this year in 2021 that they sidestepped a challenge to a Texas law, which basically had to do with 6 weeks and hearing a heartbeat. And in that case, a private citizen could sue someone who helped someone get an abortion for civil damages. So it's sort of a creative way that hasn't been ruled unconstitutional, so the Supreme Court was able to sidestep that. But going back to Roe v. Wade, that was sort of a right where the court at that time was judicial activist, at least most historians agree. And so abortion's not mentioned in the Constitution. You don't see any mention about abortion back then. And of course, we didn't have advanced surgery or the medicine that we have today, which makes abortion more safe. So it wasn't as much of an issue back then. So that's why it's a challenge for the Supreme Court, especially if you're a conservative justice following the strict constructionalist idea, having judicial restraint. How do you deal with an issue that's not addressed in the Constitution? Now, we also talked about slavery. I mean, the Constitution was written when slavery was very common in the United States. And you look back and it's kind of hard to justify that. I'm not sure how a strict constructionalist would justify interpreting the Constitution when slavery is mentioned and say that we have to stick to this document. The document evolves, and that's why I like the comedian, because he does talk about how it's an evolving document. And there's a balance there between what I'm teaching you as far as the document being the foundation of all US law, maybe our DNA that's hard to modify, but it does evolve over the years. So there's a balance between those two concepts, and that's what you need to know at the end of 4.1. All right, 4.2 covers the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause is especially important when we focus the Constitution on business law, like we're covering. So the federal government, under the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, is given authority, given the power to regulate commerce among the states. So when we talk about federalism, and that's the compromise between the power of states and the power of the federal government and the cooperation between the two, when we talk about that, commerce is something that the authors of the Constitution, the people who signed on to it, the original agreement, the contract that the states had with the federal government definitely contemplated commerce. So that's where an activist court in the 20th century, early 20th century, an activist court started to use the Commerce Clause and say, hey, we can make some changes in the United States for the better under this Commerce Clause. So a couple of cases we're going to talk about are Hammer versus Degenhardt, 1918, and that reversed a case, or sorry, the case in 1941. So basically, Hammer versus Degenhardt had sidestepped children being able to, factories using child labor. Okay, so that was initially that was, ruled in the United States to be tolerable by a conservative court, and then it was reversed later, and they used the Commerce Clause both to justify both decisions. And there's a trend toward in the United States not using child labor. But that's a case where the Commerce Clause is used both ways. Then we evolve into the 1930s, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was, a Democrat president, considered liberal, certainly in those days and in hindsight. And the president who served the most terms in United States history. And because of the impact that he had on the country, we amended the Constitution to what we have now, which is limiting presidents to 2 terms. All right, and then we have an activist court in the 60s, and this is where I think it's interesting in history where we have this desegregation of the United States. It started with Brown versus Board of Education, at least the federal government saying that in the United States, we can't have segregation. And then we see the Supreme Court taking on private businesses. So there's a difference between saying you can't have segregation in schools where, it's public schools, it's government funded offices. Certainly the courts can impose desegregation in schools or in the government offices themselves. But how does the Supreme Court reach into private businesses and assert desegregation, which isn't addressed in the Constitution? Desegregation happened because of the evolution of American values, and that being present in the binding cases from the Supreme Court. So now we're going to learn about a case, Katzenbach versus McClung. That's from 1964, and it basically involves a restaurant that segregated. They would only allow white customers into the restaurant, and everyone else could get takeout. And their defense was, hey, we're minding our own business. We only have people that come to this restaurant generally from local Birmingham, Alabama. We're not advertising to people outside, so the Commerce Clause shouldn't apply because it's just domestic. It's our area, and we should be allowed to have this rule. So let's take a look at this video here, which I think does a little better job illustrating the case than I can do without it.
Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, popularly known as the Commerce Clause, grants Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. Congress has used this power to regulate commercial goods, products, activities, and travel between states. In the modern era, the United States Supreme Court has interpreted this power broadly, allowing Congress to regulate in-state activities that have a substantial economic effect on interstate commerce. In the 1960s, Congress used its Commerce Clause power to combat racial discrimination by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Congress passed the act to prevent discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, or national origin. Title II of the act granted a right of equal access to places of public accommodation that affect interstate commerce, including hotels and restaurants. On the same day in 1964, the court issued two decisions that addressed challenges to Title II of the act. In Heart of Atlanta Motel, Inc. versus United States, the court upheld the constitutionality of Title II as applied to hotels. Then, in Katzenbach versus McClung, the court turned its attention to restaurants. Under the act, a restaurant affects interstate commerce if it serves interstate travelers, or if a substantial portion of its food comes from another state. Ollie McClung owned and operated a local restaurant called Ollie's Barbecue in Birmingham, Alabama. Ollie's Barbecue was located next to an interstate highway, and 46% of the food served at the restaurant came from another state. Since its opening in 1927, Ollie's Barbecue had refused to seat and serve Black people. This violated the right to equal access under the Civil Rights Act. McClung filed a complaint against the federal government, which was represented by Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Alabama. McClung argued that the act was unconstitutional as applied to his restaurant, which had virtually no effect on interstate commerce. The district court agreed, finding that there wasn't a close enough connection between discrimination at Ollie's Barbecue and the food purchased by the restaurant in interstate commerce. Katzenbach appealed the district court's decision directly to the United States Supreme Court. The issue on appeal was whether Congress had exceeded its power under the Commerce Clause by applying Title II of the Civil Rights Act to local restaurants. Writing the majority opinion, Justice Clark held that the court must uphold legislation enacted under the Commerce Clause when it finds that Congress had a rational basis for concluding that the regulated activity substantially affects interstate commerce. At the lower court hearings, evidence showed that Black people spent less money in areas where racial discrimination was widely practiced. Also, restaurants that refused to serve Black people had fewer customers and thus bought and sold less food through interstate commerce. Finally, Black people were less likely to travel between states due to racial discrimination in restaurants. Therefore, based on this evidence, the court held that Congress had a rational basis for concluding that racial discrimination in restaurants had a substantial effect on interstate commerce. Title II of the Civil Rights Act, as applied to McClung's restaurant, was a constitutional exercise of Congress's commerce power. The district court's judgment was reversed. Justice Black concurred. Black wrote that the Commerce Clause, in conjunction with the Necessary and Proper Clause, gave Congress the power to regulate local entities that burdened the flow of interstate commerce. Justice Douglas also concurred. Douglas believed that Congress's power to enact Title II came from both the Commerce Clause as well as the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Douglas argued that basing the decision on equal protection grounds would have had a more definitive effect because it could end discrimination in all places of public accommodation, regardless of their effect on interstate commerce. Finally, Justice Goldberg's concurrence found clear authorization from both the Commerce Clause and the 14th Amendment. Goldberg emphasized that the purpose of Title II wasn't to regulate commerce, but rather to protect human dignity against discriminatory conduct. Katzenbach versus McClung is significant for finding that Congress could use its commerce power to combat racial discrimination in places of public accommodation. This decision also promoted judicial deference to Congress's power under the Commerce Clause.
All right, so we see the
In 1964, the Heart of Atlanta Motel founded.
Okay, so we see the Commerce Clause from the Constitution giving us, more and more of our modern federal protections against some of the evils that we saw, at the beginning of our country, slavery, racism going to segregation, and the evolution of how the Constitution affects businesses. And I think more and more the trend is that you're not going to get away with, using some kind of defense about the federal government not having control over something that, is of value under the Constitution, like commerce. You know, what, you know, what is our U.S. value that we're highlighting here, that we're able to stop racism and segregation? It comes down to commerce and business. So that's why I think, you know, this is the highlight of the chapter about constitutional law, because we're seeing it affect us day to day. And I think you can see sort of how businesses are affected by COVID mask mandates or vaccination mandates. You know, where is the limit of the government's control over your business? All right, moving on into the 80s and the dormant Commerce Clause, we have a less active Supreme Court. So there's some conservatives that have been appointed. But we see the evolution of this still continuing. And the case from, I think it's 1981, we have Castle versus Consolidated Freightways, which is a case from Iowa. So imagine Iowa, you think of one of the states that's full of lots of farm country. And if you're flying over the United States over to the West Coast, you don't see a whole lot going on. But what they do have is some roadways, and the people in Iowa who live there decided to create a law dealing with trucks with going across the state, traveling across their roadways. And the law that they made said that they don't want trucks with more than one trailer stringed together crossing their state, because they felt it was unsafe. They didn't want these one driver being in control of more than one trailer. So companies that were engaging in commerce across Iowa and needing to use their roads were restricted to either only have one truck, or they could use a different route, or they could hire someone in Iowa to hook up their truck to the extra trailer, get across Iowa to obey this law. And that was where the United States, in that case, the United States Supreme Court decided that that was an undue burden under the Commerce Clause. That rule that they were trying to protect Iowa, you know, they said that it was about safety, or I guess that's primarily what their defense was unconstitutional because it was an undue burden under the Constitution, under the Commerce Clause. So that's an interesting evolving field of law too. But what you see is a trend toward the federal government being able to exercise the Commerce Clause and have more power over businesses that might not seem like they're under the control of the federal government. All right, that's 4.3. Then in 4.4, we talk about the preemption doctrine and the supremacy clause. And basically, Congress can declare exclusive regulatory authority over a particular kind of industry. So think of nuclear weapons, for example, or nuclear power. Under the supremacy clause, the federal government can say, we have control over that particular industry. And that's been upheld in cases involving that kind of stuff. It's especially important when it comes to the environment, if you think about it, because states aren't walled off with their own little lakes and ponds. I mean, if you look back at history of the United States, we're constantly talking about the rivers that run in between the states. And, you know, I talked about the case involving Iowa. We've got roads crisscrossing. We don't really have borders between the states. So if you think of the environment, you know, people know where the state border is, but animals and nature don't know where it is. So the environment is trending. It goes back and forth, and it depends on an issue, whether it's water or air. But that's the part of the Constitution that the Supreme Court or other courts are using as the supremacy clause. And the essence of that is that the federal government has supremacy over the states when it comes to things like that. And that's how it's going to be interpreted. if you're a business owner, you know, and if your lawyer is looking at state regulations versus federal, they're going to have to look at the trend and where we are politically with those issues. Now, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and business, we've already talked about long arm statutes in Chapter 3 with litigation, but that's going to apply because you've got that concept of long arm statutes already from Chapter 3 and the Bill of Rights. And, you know, in putting it basically, those rights are federal and the states all signed on to it. It's kind of like a contract that we agreed to. I mentioned earlier that New York State didn't sign on right away. We were one of the outliers. And so the rights guaranteed under the Bill of Rights are, I think we have to look at that from a contract point of view. So it'll make more sense a bit later in the class when we get to more contract issues. But we've already talked about the social contract and the meeting of the minds and what the agreement is with federalism. Because when we cover the Constitution, I think that's where we're really got to nail down federalism and what it is, that concept. And it has to do with a contract between the state governments and their power and authority and our federal government, which has, albeit limited, authority over the states, but it's growing. When you see how commerce is growing, it's evolving in the direction of more federal government power. All right, Judge Peacock said his first, the First Amendment was his favorite, and it was first priority for the framers of the Constitution, or maybe some of the states that they were dealing with. And it's come up recently with the Citizens United versus FEC. And that's a case that in my lifetime probably was the most stunning ruling by the Supreme Court. And it has to do with the First Amendment. The video I'm going to show you about it is, just keep in mind that it's from the Federalist Society, so it's a bit of a conservative viewpoint. And I think that's good for the class because a lot of the press that came out at the time was very liberal. So this should give you a balanced viewpoint of Citizens United.
Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission declared unconstitutional a portion of federal campaign finance law that prohibited corporations from spending money to purchase speech that mentioned a candidate for federal office if that speech was broadcast within 30 days of a primary or 60 days of a general election. Basic premises of election law at issue in Citizens United was whether the First Amendment prohibits the government from making distinctions among types of speakers. In particular, the question was whether corporations have a right to speak independently of campaigns and to use their general corporate treasury funds to produce political speech. The court's holding was based on the principle that the First Amendment forbids the government from drawing distinctions among speakers. Some people sometimes claim that Citizens United permitted corporations to contribute to campaigns. That is incorrect. The case did not involve contributions at all, but rather independent expenditures, and the court did nothing to undermine the complete federal ban on corporate contributions. Citizens United was a nonprofit corporation that produced a documentary critical of Hillary Clinton, who at the time was a candidate for president. Citizens United wanted to distribute the documentary and to advertise it. Because Citizens United received some money from for-profit corporations, its spending money on speech mentioning Mrs. Clinton violated the ban on corporate spending in elections. The Supreme Court pointed out that the documentary and advertising would unquestionably have been constitutionally protected if engaged in by individuals. The court therefore had to determine
whether the corporate nature of the speaker stripped the speech of the protection it otherwise would have had. The court held that the speech was equally protected regardless of whether the speaker was a corporation or an individual. The effect of Citizens United has not been as large as some people anticipated. Few corporations have been willing to devote large amounts of money to spending in political campaigns. It has, however, led to the proliferation of the so-called super PAC, an organization that collects and distributes political contributions. A super PAC differs from ordinary PACs because, after Citizens United, it accepts contributions from corporations. But because we still have the ban on corporate contributions to campaigns, a super PAC cannot take its funds and give them to a candidate. Rather, a super PAC can collect funds from anybody, including corporations, but the super PAC must spend those only on independent speech. Citizens United has been criticized for placing restrictions on the government's ability to limit the effects of corporate power. On the other hand, people who consider themselves to be protectors of free speech look at Citizens United in a much more positive light and say that it stands for the proposition that the government should not tell us what kind of speech we can produce or what kind of speech we can listen to.
All right, so that's a precedent, where we talked in chapter 1 about the intersection between law and politics, and that's a recent case that establishes that precedent, and I'm sure we haven't heard the end of that. Moving to the Fourth Amendment, that's, I think, the next amendment that affects businesses a lot because, as an individual, the Fourth Amendment protects your right against unreasonable search and seizure, and that extends over to your business too. So we're going to study a case a bit later that involves a business owner in chapter 5 dealing with administrative law. So you have a lot of regulators in that part of the law. You have not police necessarily, but federal and state government administrative agencies that come in and do inspections. And so you can invoke the Fourth Amendment that they can't have an unreasonable search and seizure, just like you learn that police have limited authority to engage in search and seizure. You have some rights to privacy, and the word privacy is not in the Fourth Amendment. There's an evolution of those constitutional rights in the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure, and also the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination that have formed a hybrid of evolution of law in the Supreme Court, giving individuals and businesses some degree of privacy, some expectation of privacy, some protection from government intervention. And we'll cover more of this in chapter 5 when it comes to administrative law. But just one example in chapter 4.5 is the case involving Dow Chemical. So Dow Chemical had been engaging in some practices in their business that were visible from surveillance flights, and they could see in these open fields some violations of environmental laws. And Dow Chemical, lost that challenge, and the court drew a line there saying that if it's available and it can be seen from the air, that's where we're going to limit your right to privacy. So administrative agencies can enforce environmental protections to some extent by doing flyovers in a situation like that. Griswold versus Connecticut is another important case that comes up at the end of chapter 4, and it has to do with the right to privacy. It's a case from 1965, and it was settled a 7-2 decision, so it wasn't very controversial. You had a strong majority of the Supreme Court saying that a couple who was engaged in private, consensual, sexual contact using contraceptives, that under an old Connecticut law, which was still on the books, could not be enforced. So that law that outlawed contraceptives for adults engaging in consensual sex, that rule, in and of itself, by 1965, the Supreme Court had said that that was on its face unconstitutional because that's private activity. The government has no business being in their bedroom. So that's the lesson in that case. And then, of course, we talked about Roe v. Wade, which I think, that's how evolution happens. You sort of say, well, if they got no business being in their bedroom, or if the government has no control over contraceptives, then, we're taking this right to privacy, even though it's not spelled out in the Constitution, and we're evolving it to the standards that we believe today. Another case at the end of the chapter involves a 1942 case, and it's Wickard versus Filborn. And that's a case where there were some federal government controls over wheat prices. So, and those were ruled to be constitutional. So you see the evolution of the federal government being able to control commerce. And the defense in that case, the farmer said, hey, I only sell to, I use the wheat for my own animals and I sell to just some local people here. What the court did, though, is they said, you know what, there's just like in Katzenbach versus McClung, they said there's an effect by you supplying even just those local people with wheat that's under the price, you're affecting the price that we're establishing under our authority of the Commerce Clause. So we still have authority over your wheat production, even though it's limited to domestic purposes. It's maybe just a small operation, but it still has to follow this law because it affects commerce. It affects the supply chain generally. We talked about Cassell versus Consolidated Freightways already, and the Iowa law that had to do with double trucking restrictions against that was ruled unconstitutional. We already talked about Citizens United, but the last case is Hunt versus Washington Apple Advertising Commission in 1977, which ruled that a North Carolina law restricting apples coming in from other states and their grading of the apples. So if you think about apples, we're in apple country here. And, if you go apple picking, you see apples that maybe have some blemishes to them or whatever. Well, there's a grading system there's several. Each state's developed their own, and then there was a federal one. And the state of Washington, which produces the most apples at the time, and had a heavy advertising campaign, they had a great reputation, and North Carolina wanted to protect their apple industry and said that these Washington standards, they're illegal in their state. And the Supreme Court had ruled that that the North Carolina law was unconstitutional. And I'm just going to finish with a commercial from the 1970s for Washington apples, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
This is our factory and one of our best workers. We take the sun, clear glacial water, and deep volcanic soil to create a product that will surely make you healthy and perhaps even wealthy and wise. Fresh country apples from Washington State, the original health food.